He thought asking her to play would be harmless entertainment, but within minutes, the entire room would realize they were witnessing the unraveling of a man who had built his reputation on breaking others. Before we continue, where are you watching from? Drop your city or state in the comments below. And if you believe in dignity and second chances, hit like and subscribe because stories like this remind us what quiet strength really looks like. Now back to Clara Bennett. The grand hall of the Emerson Performing Arts Center glowed under golden chandeliers, polished marble floors reflecting the soft shimmer of evening gowns and tailored tuxedos, the kind of place where every whisper felt expensive and every glance carried judgment. And in the far corner, barely noticed by anyone, Clara stood with a small clipboard pressed gently against her chest, her gray cardigan slightly worn at the sleeves, her shoes practical, silent against the floor, the kind of woman people looked past without a second thought. At 42, Clara had perfected the art of invisibility, moving between rows of velvet seats, adjusting programs, guiding guests with a polite nod, her presence acknowledged only when needed and forgotten just as quickly. And that was exactly how Maestro Victor Hale preferred it, a man whose name alone filled concert halls across the country, whose performances were described as transcendent, whose temper, though less publicized, was just as legendary, because Hale didn't just demand perfection, he enforced it, often at the expense of those he deemed beneath him. That night was supposed to be flawless, a showcase of elite talent, investors seated in the front rows, critics ready with sharpened pens. But when the scheduled pianist failed to arrive, a ripple of tension spread quietly behind the stage, assistants whispering, phones lighting up, and Hale's jaw tightening just enough to betray his irritation. He paced once, twice, then stopped, his eyes scanning the room with calculated precision until they landed on Clara, standing quietly near the aisle. And something in his expression shifted, not concern, not panic, but opportunity. "You," he said, his voice cutting cleanly through the low hum of conversation, and for a moment, Clara didn't even realize he was speaking to her, until heads began to turn and a subtle path opened in the crowd, all eyes now drawn to the simplest figure in the room. "Yes, you," Hale repeated, a faint smile forming, one that never quite reached his eyes. "Come here." The room fell into a curious hush as Clara approached, each step measured, her fingers tightening slightly around the clipboard, not from fear, but from something deeper, something quieter, something no one there could possibly read. Hale gestured toward the grand piano at center stage, its black surface gleaming under the lights like a challenge waiting to be accepted. "We seem to have a small problem tonight," he announced, his voice now carrying across the hall, smooth, confident, practiced. "But perhaps we can turn it into something entertaining." A few soft chuckles rippled through the audience. "Tell me," he continued, glancing down at Clara with open amusement, "do you play?" The question hung in the air longer than it should have, stretching just enough to invite judgment, and somewhere in the back, someone whispered, "This should be interesting," followed by a quiet laugh quickly stifled. Clara lifted her gaze, meeting his for the first time, her expression calm, unreadable, and for a brief second, Hale hesitated, not enough to change course, but enough to register something he couldn't quite name. Then he dismissed it. "Let's have a little test," he said, stepping aside with a flourish. "I'll choose the piece." And as he named it, a notoriously difficult composition that even seasoned professionals approach with caution, a subtle shift moved through the crowd, curiosity sharpening into anticipation, anticipation into quiet disbelief, because this was no longer entertainment. This was a setup, and everyone in that room knew exactly how it was supposed to end. Clara walked to the piano without another word, the soft echo of her steps fading as she reached the bench, and for a moment, just a moment, the entire hall seemed to hold its breath, waiting for the inevitable failure, completely unaware that the first note would change everything. Clara lowered herself onto the piano bench with a calm that felt almost out of place in a room charged with expectation. The polished wood cooled beneath her fingertips as she gently set the clipboard aside, her movements unhurried, deliberate, as though she had all the time in the world while hundreds of eyes studied her like a spectacle waiting to unfold. And somewhere near the front, a woman leaned toward her companion and whispered, "This is going to be embarrassing," her voice just loud. enough to ripple through a few nearby seats, followed by a soft, restrained laugh that quickly dissolved into the heavy silence pressing down on the hall. Maestro Hale remained standing just off to the side, arms loosely crossed, his posture relaxed, confident, already certain of the outcome, because he had orchestrated moments like this before, moments where someone stepped forward thinking they might prove something, only to falter under pressure, reinforcing everything he believed about talent, about hierarchy, about who belonged on that stage and who did not. Clara did not look at him again. Instead, her gaze settled on the keys, black and white stretching before her like a familiar landscape hidden beneath years of dust and distance. And for a brief second, something shifted in her expression, subtle, almost imperceptible, as if the noise of the room had begun to fade, replaced by something quieter, something internal. Her right hand hovered above the keyboard, fingers slightly curled, trembling just enough for those watching closely to notice, and a young man in the second row smirked, nudging his friend as if to say, "Here it comes," while another guest adjusted her posture, preparing to witness the inevitable misstep that would confirm what everyone already assumed. The air felt thinner somehow, stretched tight between anticipation and judgment, and then Clara inhaled slowly, a measured breath that seemed to steady not just her hands, but the very space around her, and when she exhaled, her fingers descended. The first note did not stumble. It did not hesitate. It rang out clear and precise, cutting through the room with a confidence that immediately disrupted the quiet assumptions lingering in the air, and a few heads lifted, just slightly, as if unsure whether they had heard correctly. Clara's left hand followed, joining the melody with a balance that felt intentional, controlled, not the tentative touch of someone guessing, but the practiced motion of someone who understood exactly where each note belonged. And the young man who had smirked seconds earlier leaned back, his expression tightening, confusion replacing amusement. Hale's posture shifted, not dramatically, but enough to reveal a flicker of attention where there had been none before, his eyes narrowing just slightly as he watched her hands move across the keys with increasing certainty, each phrase connecting seamlessly to the next, building not just accuracy, but depth, the kind of interpretation that could not be mimicked or memorized overnight. Clara's shoulders relaxed as she played, the initial tension dissolving into something fluid, something almost effortless, and the hall responded in kind, the restless energy settling into a focused stillness, conversations forgotten, judgments suspended mid-thought. The piece he had chosen was known for its complexity, its rapid transitions, its unforgiving demands on timing and control, yet Clara navigated it with a quiet authority that began to reshape the atmosphere entirely. And somewhere in the back, a man who had been checking his watch slowly lowered his hand, his attention now fixed on the stage. Hale uncrossed his arms. It was a small movement, but in that room, it carried weight, because it signaled the first crack in his certainty, the first moment where the outcome no longer felt guaranteed. And as Clara moved into a more intricate passage, her fingers accelerating with precision rather than panic, the realization began to spread, subtle at first, then undeniable, that this was not a mistake, not luck, not a fluke, but something far more unsettling to those who had already decided who she was the moment she stepped into the light. And still, she did not look up. She did not acknowledge the shifting energy around her, the growing silence that now felt heavier than before. Because it was no longer filled with expectation of failure, but with something else entirely, something closer to disbelief, as the woman no one had noticed just minutes ago continued to play as if the stage had always belonged to her. The melody did not just continue, it evolved, and with each passing second, it became impossible to deny what was unfolding in front of them, because Clara was no longer simply playing the piece, she was reshaping it, breathing something into it that had been missing even in the most polished performances, and the audience felt it before they understood it, a subtle tightening in the chest, a stillness that spread row by row as if the music itself demanded their full attention, and somewhere, near the center aisle, a woman who had been whispering earlier slowly straightened in her seat, her lips parting slightly, her earlier amusement dissolving into quiet astonishment. Clara's hands moved with increasing confidence, but not with showmanship, not with the exaggerated flair that performers often use to impress. Instead, there was restraint, control, a kind of precision that suggested years of discipline hidden beneath the surface of a life no one had bothered to look closely at. And as she transitioned into one of the most technically demanding sections of the composition, a section known to expose even the smallest weakness, the tension in the room shifted. Again, because now they were no longer waiting for her to fail. They were watching to see if she could sustain what she had already proven. Maestro Hale felt it before he admitted it, a quiet discomfort settling beneath his composed exterior, because this was not how the moment was supposed to unfold, not according to his design, not according to the unspoken rules he had built his career around. And as Clara's fingers navigated the rapid sequence with effortless clarity, his gaze sharpened, searching for a flaw, a missed note, a hesitation, anything that would restore the balance he believed in. But there was none. Instead, there was something far more unsettling, consistency, and not just consistency, but intention, as though every note she played carried meaning beyond technical execution. And that was when the first true crack appeared, not in the music, but in him. He took a small step forward, almost unconsciously, drawn closer by something he could not quite control, and those nearest to him noticed, exchanging quick glances, because they had seen him command rooms, dominate stages, reduce seasoned performers to nervous silence. But they had never seen him watch like this, with uncertainty creeping into the edges of his expression. Clara's posture remained steady, her shoulders relaxed, her head slightly inclined toward the keys, completely absorbed in the flow of the piece. And for a fleeting moment, the grand hall, the chandeliers, the audience, all of it seemed to fall away, leaving only the sound, pure and uninterrupted, filling the space with a kind of quiet authority that demanded respect without ever asking for it. In the back row, a man who had spent decades attending performances leaned forward, his eyes narrowing not in skepticism, but in recognition, because what he was hearing was not just skill, it was interpretation at a level that could not be taught in classrooms or perfected through repetition alone. It was something lived, something earned, and that realization spread slowly, like a ripple moving outward, touching one listener after another. The whispers had vanished completely now, replaced by a silence so complete it felt almost sacred, the kind of silence that only existed when something truly extraordinary was happening. And even those who had come expecting nothing more than an evening of predictable excellence found themselves caught in something deeper, something they could not easily explain. Hale's jaw tightened slightly as he listened, the faintest shift betraying the internal recalculation taking place behind his composed exterior, because the narrative he had constructed, the simple equation of status and talent, of appearance and worth, was beginning to fracture in real time, and the longer Clara played, the more undeniable that fracture became. Then came the passage he knew better than anyone, the turning point of the piece, where interpretation separated mastery from mere competence, and, for the first time since she began, Clara allowed a subtle change in tempo, not a mistake, not hesitation, but choice, deliberate and precise, reshaping the phrase in a way that was both unexpected and undeniably right. And Hale froze, not physically, but internally, because he recognized it instantly. She was not following the composition, she was conversing with it, and in doing so, she had crossed a line few ever reached. And in that moment, the room did not just listen, it surrendered. The shift was undeniable now, not just in the music, but in the room itself, because what had begun as a quiet setup had transformed into something far more dangerous for the man who had orchestrated it. And Maestro Hale could feel it slipping, control, attention, authority, all of it, inch by inch, note by note, as Clara continued to play with a level of command that no longer invited doubt, only recognition. Her fingers moved across the keys with a fluid certainty that erased every assumption that had been made about her just minutes earlier. And as she entered the final movement of the piece, the energy changed again, deeper now, heavier, as if the performance itself had crossed a threshold that could not be undone. In the front row, a critic who had spent years dissecting performances with cold precision leaned forward, his pen forgotten in his hand, because what he was witnessing refused to fit into any framework he had relied on. And beside him, a donor who had attended hundreds of elite concerts sat completely still, her expression no longer polished and detached, but openly moved. as though something personal had been touched without warning. Clara did not acknowledge any of it. Her world had narrowed to the instrument, to the resonance of each note, to the quiet conversation unfolding between memory and sound. And though no one in that room could see it, fragments of her past lived within every phrase, years of discipline, of sacrifice, of stepping away when life demanded something else. All of it carried in the way she shaped the music now, not to impress, not to prove, but because it was the only way she knew how to play. Hale's composure tightened further, his breathing slower, more measured, as he stood just off to the side, no longer the center of the evening, no longer the authority commanding the narrative, but a witness to something he could not interrupt without exposing what had already become obvious, that he had misjudged, completely, and the realization settled into him with a weight that no applause could soften. The final passage approached, a sequence known for its emotional demand as much as its technical precision, and the room seemed to lean into it collectively. Every listener pulled forward by an invisible thread, waiting, not for failure now, but for completion, for the resolution of something that had grown far beyond a simple performance. Clara's tempo slowed, not in hesitation, but in intention, stretching the moment just enough to let the music breathe, to let every note land with clarity. And as the final chords unfolded, each one placed with quiet certainty, the hall felt suspended, caught between sound and silence, until the last note finally settled into the air and faded. No one moved. No one spoke. The silence that followed was not empty. It was full, dense with realization, with the quiet understanding that something irreversible had just taken place, and for a long second, it held, unbroken, until somewhere in the back, a single breath released, almost audible in its relief. Clara's hands remained on the keys for a moment longer, not seeking acknowledgment, not waiting for reaction, simply allowing the final resonance to fade completely before she lifted them gently, her posture unchanged, her expression calm, as though the weight of what had just happened belonged to the room, not to her. Then she stood, not with flourish, not with expectation, just a simple, measured movement, stepping away from the piano as quietly as she had approached it. And that was when the spell broke, not with noise at first, but with movement, small, hesitant shifts as people looked at one another, searching for confirmation that what they had experienced was real, that it had not been imagined. Hill did not move. His eyes remained fixed on the instrument, then on Clara, then back again, as if trying to reconcile two versions of reality that no longer aligned. And in that stillness, something unspoken settled over him. Not humiliation in the way he had once inflicted on others, but something far more profound, the quiet collapse of certainty, the realization that the standards he had enforced so rigidly had just been rewritten in front of him, without permission, without warning, by someone he had not even considered worthy of the stage. And in that moment, before a single hand began to rise in applause, before a single voice broke the silence, the truth was already clear to everyone in the room, even if no one had yet found the words to say it. The silence did not shatter all at once. It unraveled slowly, like a tension finally releasing its hold on every person in the room. And then, from somewhere near the center, a single pair of hands came together, hesitant at first, as if unsure whether applause was enough to match what had just happened. And then another followed, and another, until the sound built, not into polite recognition, but into something fuller, something undeniable, rising from every corner of the hall as people stood, without being asked, drawn to their feet by a force they could not quite explain. Clara paused mid-step as the sound reached her, not startled, not overwhelmed, but simply aware, turning slightly as if to acknowledge the room without fully stepping back into it. Her expression unchanged, steady, grounded, as though applause had never been the reason she had played. The ovation grew stronger, filling the space with a kind of energy that had shifted completely from where it began, no longer driven by expectation or status, but by respect, earned in the most undeniable way. And still, she did not seek it, did not linger in it, because for her, the performance had already ended the moment the final note faded. In the front row, the critic who had once prepared to dismiss the evening entirely now stood with the others, his earlier certainty replaced by a quiet humility, his eyes fixed not on the maestro who had drawn him there, but on the woman who had changed the entire narrative in less than 10 minutes. Nearby, the same guests who had whispered and smirked now clapped with a different intensity. Their expressions softened, their assumptions quietly undone, and the shift was not lost on anyone, least of all the man who had initiated it all. Maestro Hale remained still for a moment longer, the applause washing over him not as recognition, but as contrast, because he understood what had happened more clearly than anyone else in that room. He had not simply been overshadowed, he had been corrected, and not through confrontation, not through defiance, but through something far more powerful, undeniable excellence delivered without a single word. Slowly, he stepped forward, the movement deliberate, measured, reclaiming just enough presence to remind the room who he was, but not enough to overshadow what had just occurred. And when he reached the edge of the stage, he turned toward Clara, the applause still echoing around them. And for the first time that evening, there was no performance in his expression, no calculated control, only recognition. "Miss Bennet," he said, his voice carrying, though softer than before, stripped of its earlier edge, "I believe we owe you more than a test." The words settled into the room, quiet but significant, and for a moment, Clara simply looked at him, her gaze steady, neither challenging nor yielding, just present, and in that exchange, something passed between them that did not require explanation. She did not respond immediately, and the pause itself held weight, not as hesitation, but as choice, as though she was deciding whether this moment deserved more than silence. Then, with the smallest nod, she acknowledged him, not as a superior, not as an authority, but as an equal, and turned to leave the stage. The applause followed her movement, rising again as she stepped away from the piano, each step measured, unhurried, returning to the quiet space she had occupied before all of this began, and yet everything had changed. Behind her, Hale remained where he stood, watching, the sound of the ovation no longer directed at him, and for the first time in years, perhaps ever, he did not attempt to reclaim it. Instead, he let it pass, understanding something that could not be undone, that the room had seen something real, something unfiltered by reputation or expectation, and once seen, it could not be forgotten. As Clara reached the edge of the stage and disappeared into the soft shadows beyond the lights, the applause continued for several seconds more before gradually fading, leaving behind a lingering stillness, not the same as before, but deeper, more reflective, as if the room itself was processing what it had just witnessed. And somewhere in that quiet, a realization settled in, not spoken, not announced, but understood by everyone present, that greatness does not always arrive with recognition, and sometimes it waits quietly in the background until the moment it is finally seen, and when it is, it does not ask for permission to be acknowledged. The applause faded, but the impact did not. It lingered in the air like a question no one was ready to answer. And as the audience slowly returned to their seats, the energy in the Emerson Performing Arts Center had shifted into something quieter, more introspective, as if each person was replaying the same realization in their own mind, wondering how they had missed it, how someone like Clara Bennett could stand just feet away for weeks, months even, and remain unseen until a single moment forced everyone to look again. Backstage, the polished noise of the hall softened into muted footsteps and hushed voices, but Clara moved through it the same way she always had, steady, unhurried, her presence blending back into the background as if nothing extraordinary had just happened. And yet the glances that followed her were no longer dismissive. They lingered, curious, uncertain, searching for something they could now no longer ignore. A young stage assistant stepped aside to let her pass, his posture shifting subtly, not out of obligation, but respect, the kind that forms instinctively when something undeniable has been witnessed, and Clara acknowledged it with a small nod. Nothing more, because for her, nothing about who she was had changed, only what others had chosen to see. Behind her, the murmurs began to grow, low voices piecing together fragments of speculation. Questions layered with disbelief. Who is she? Someone asked. Has she performed before? Another wondered, but no one seemed to have an answer, and that absence of explanation only deepened the weight of what they had just experienced. In a private corridor just off the stage, Maestro Hale stood alone for a moment, his reflection staring back at him from a tall mirror framed in gold, his posture still composed, but his eyes carrying something new, something quieter, the unmistakable presence of doubt, not in her ability, but in his own certainty. And as he adjusted his cufflink out of habit, the movement felt slower, less automatic, as though even the smallest gestures now required reconsideration. He had built his reputation on control, on precision, on knowing exactly how a moment would unfold before it ever began, but tonight had slipped beyond that, and in doing so, it had exposed something he had not allowed himself to question in years. That talent did not always announce itself in the ways he expected, and more importantly, that he had stopped looking for it where it mattered most. The sound of footsteps approached, soft but deliberate, and when he turned, Clara was there, not seeking him, not avoiding him, simply crossing the space as part of her routine, but the moment paused anyway, suspended between them with an unspoken awareness. For a second, Hale considered speaking again, offering something more formal, more public, something that might restore a sense of balance, but the words did not come, because anything rehearsed would have felt insufficient, and anything honest required a humility he had not yet fully found. Clara met his gaze briefly, her expression unchanged, calm, steady, and in that brief exchange, there was no tension, no triumph, only clarity, as if she had already moved past the moment that still held him in place. Then she continued walking, her footsteps fading down the corridor, leaving behind a silence that felt different from before, not heavy with expectation, but with reflection. Back in the hall, conversations resumed, but they carried a different tone now, less certain, more thoughtful, as though the evening had quietly rewritten something fundamental in the minds of those who had witnessed it. And even as the next performance was announced, the attention it received felt divided, because part of the audience was still elsewhere, still replaying the sound of a single piano, still trying to understand how something so simple could feel so transformative. And in that lingering uncertainty, one truth settled quietly, not declared, not debated, but understood, that the most powerful moments do not always come from those who demand the spotlight, but from those who never needed it to begin with. The rest of the evening continued, but something had permanently shifted beneath the surface, and even as the next performer took the stage with flawless technique and polished confidence, the applause felt measured, almost restrained, as though the audience was comparing everything they heard to something they had not expected to experience that night, something quieter yet undeniably stronger. Conversations resumed in low tones between performances, but they circled back to the same question again and again, not what had been played, but who had played it, and why no one had known. In the lobby, under the soft glow of chandeliers reflecting off marble floors, guests gathered in small clusters, their voices carrying curiosity instead of certainty. She must have trained somewhere prestigious, one man insisted, adjusting his cufflinks as if that explanation alone could restore order, while another shook his head slowly. No one plays like that by accident, but you do not just disappear from the world and come back like that either. The answers did not come, and that absence lingered like a quiet challenge to everything they believed about talent and recognition. Backstage, Clara moved through her routine without interruption, collecting her clipboard, checking the final details for the closing sequence, her movements steady and familiar. Yet now every glance toward her carried a different weight, no longer dismissive, no longer indifferent, but searching, as if those around her were trying to reconcile the person they thought they knew with the reality they had just witnessed. A senior coordinator approached her cautiously, his voice softer than usual, almost careful. "Clara, that was remarkable," he said, pausing as though unsure if the word was enough, and she simply nodded, a small, polite acknowledgment, not dismissing the praise, but not holding on to it either, as if it belonged to the moment, not to her identity. Meanwhile, in a quiet office overlooking the stage, Maestro Hale sat alone for the first time that evening, the distant sound of music drifting faintly through the walls, but his attention was elsewhere, fixed on a memory that refused to settle, the image of her hands moving across the keys replaying with a clarity that made it impossible to ignore. He leaned back slightly, his fingers steepled in front of him, a habit formed over years of making decisions with absolute certainty. But tonight that certainty felt different, thinner, as though it had been tested and found incomplete. He had spent decades defining excellence, shaping careers, deciding who was worthy of the spotlight and who was not. And yet in a single moment, without announcement, without permission, that definition had been challenged in a way he could not dismiss. He stood slowly and walked toward the window, looking down at the crowd below, their movements smaller from this height, their conversations blending into a distant hum. And for the first time in years, he found himself asking a question he had not needed before, not about her, but about himself, about the limits of his own perspective, about how many moments like this he might have missed simply because he had decided, too quickly, who someone was. The thought lingered, uncomfortable but necessary, and he did not turn away from it. Back in the corridor, Clara paused briefly near a side exit, the noise of the building fading behind her as she stepped into a quieter space, the air cooler, the lights softer. And for a moment, she allowed herself to stand still, her hand resting lightly against the wall, as if grounding herself after something that had required more than it had revealed. There was no smile, no visible relief, only a quiet steadiness, as though the performance had not changed her, but had simply allowed something long held to surface again, if only for a moment. Footsteps approached from behind, hesitant, then stopping just short, and a voice, younger, uncertain, broke the silence. "Why did you stop playing?" The question carried no accusation, only genuine curiosity, and Clara turned slightly, considering it, her gaze thoughtful but calm, and after a brief pause, she answered softly, "Because sometimes it is enough to remind people what is possible." The words settled gently into the space between them, simple, but carrying a depth that did not require explanation. And as she turned and continued toward the exit, leaving the building behind her, the question remained, not just for the person who had asked it, but for everyone who had witnessed what happened that night, because some moments are not meant to last forever, only long enough to change the way you see what was always there. The night did not end when Clara stepped outside. It continued in the minds of everyone who had been inside, replaying itself in fragments that refused to fade. And back in the grand hall, even as the final performance concluded and guests began to rise from their seats, there was a hesitation in the way they moved, as if leaving too quickly might mean losing hold of something they had only just begun to understand. Conversations filled the space again, but they carried a different tone now, quieter, more deliberate, the kind that follows a moment no one can easily explain. And again, her name surfaced, uncertain at first, then more confidently, Clara Bennett, repeated as if saying it might unlock the mystery of what they had witnessed. In the front row, the critic who had once approached the evening with routine expectation closed his notebook slowly, the blank page inside untouched, because for once, there were no immediate words to capture what had happened, no framework that felt sufficient. And as he stood, he glanced back at the stage, the piano now still under the dimming lights, and he realized something that unsettled him more than he expected, that the most significant performance of the night had not been scheduled, reviewed, or even announced, and yet it was the only one that would be remembered. In the private office above, Maestro Hale remained by the window longer than he intended, the city lights stretching out beyond the glass, steady and distant, offering no answers, only reflection. And as he finally turned away, there was a quiet resolve forming beneath the uncertainty, not to reclaim control, but to understand what had slipped through it, because for the first time in years, he could not dismiss what he had seen as an exception. It demanded recognition, and more than that, it demanded change. Down below, the lobby began to empty, the polished rhythm of departure replacing the earlier anticipation of arrival. Coats retrieved, voices lowered, but even as guests stepped into the night air, they carried something with them, a subtle shift in perspective that lingered in the way they spoke, the way they paused before making assumptions, as if the evening had quietly introduced a new question into their thinking, one that would not easily disappear. Outside, the cool air wrapped around Clara as she walked away from the building, her pace steady, her figure gradually blending into the quiet of the street. And though no one followed her, no cameras turned, no crowd gathered, the significance of what she had done did not depend on any of that. because the impact had already taken root where it mattered, in the minds of those who had witnessed it. She reached the corner and paused briefly, the distant sound of the city moving around her, cars passing, footsteps echoing along the sidewalk, ordinary life continuing without interruption, and for a moment, she allowed herself to breathe in the quiet, her gaze lifting slightly, as if acknowledging something only she could fully understand. There was no regret in her expression, no longing to return to the stage, only a calm acceptance, as though she had fulfilled something that had waited patiently for its moment, and now that moment had passed, exactly as it was meant to. Behind her, in the hall she had just left, a final detail settled into place, not spoken, not announced, but quietly understood by those who remained, that what they had experienced was not just a display of skill, but a reminder, a correction to something they had allowed themselves to forget. And as the last of the lights dimmed and the doors closed for the night, that realization lingered in the silence, steady and undeniable. And somewhere within that silence, a simple truth remained, waiting for anyone willing to see it, that greatness does not arrive to prove itself. It simply reveals itself, often in the moments when no one is looking for it. And once it is seen, it changes everything. By the next morning, the city had already begun to move on, traffic flowing, schedules resuming, the quiet rhythm of everyday life reclaiming its place. But inside the Emerson Performing Arts Center, something remained, not visible, not measurable, but undeniable, like an echo that refused to fully disappear. Staff arrived early, their footsteps softer than usual against the marble floors, their conversations subdued, because even in the ordinary tasks of preparing for another day, the memory of the night before lingered, and it showed in the way they moved, in the pauses between words, in the subtle shift of attention whenever someone mentioned her name. Clara Bennett. It no longer sounded like just another name. It carried weight now, curiosity, respect, and something deeper that no one could quite define. In the main hall, the grand piano stood exactly where it had been left, its polished surface catching the morning light, quiet and still, yet holding within it the memory of something that had changed everyone who had heard it. And a technician paused briefly as he passed by, his hand hovering for a moment above the instrument before continuing on, as if acknowledging something unspoken. Upstairs, Maestro Hale entered his office earlier than usual, his posture composed but his pace measured, and as he closed the door behind him, the silence that followed felt different from the night before, not heavy, but deliberate, as though he had chosen to face it rather than escape it. He stood for a moment without moving, his gaze settling on the desk where invitations, contracts, and schedules waited for his attention, the familiar structure of control laid out before him. But none of it held the same clarity it once had, because something essential had shifted, something that could not be ignored or undone. He walked slowly to his chair and sat, his hands resting lightly against the polished wood, and for the first time in years, he did not reach for his schedule, did not begin directing the day. Instead, he allowed the silence to remain, to stretch just long enough for the truth to settle fully into place. He had spent a lifetime defining excellence, measuring it, controlling it, deciding who was worthy of recognition and who was not. But the night before had revealed something far simpler and far more profound. That excellence did not ask for permission, it did not wait to be validated, and it certainly did not conform to expectation. It simply existed, quietly, patiently, until the moment it chose to be seen. And when it was seen, it left no room for doubt. Hale exhaled slowly, the sound almost imperceptible, but it carried the weight of realization, and as he leaned back, his gaze shifting toward the window, the city stretching out beyond it, he understood something he had resisted for far too long, that authority without humility was incomplete, and that true mastery required not just the ability to judge, but the willingness to recognize what one had missed. Downstairs, the doors opened once again to a new day, guests arriving, voices rising, the familiar rhythm returning. But beneath it all, something remained altered, subtle but permanent, and though most would never speak of it directly, it would influence the way they listened, the way they looked, the way they judged, because once a truth like that is revealed, it cannot be unseen. And somewhere beyond the building, beyond the